Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Challenger Network. I'm Brandon Bickler, partner at Elixir. This is now our fourth episode of a new show where we aim to debate and discuss some of the most important stories, trends, and questions from around the business world. The topics we cover will typically have a prevailing consensus viewpoint, but on this show, we'll do everything we can to explore the alternative or contrarian view, to generate fresh ideas, creative and critical thinking, to uncover opportunities in the spots where people simply aren't looking. As part of that, we'd love to hear your views and take your questions in the comments during and after the show. And finally, and really importantly, if you have a topic you think we should cover, please let us know. Today, I'm joined by David Kelly. David's a consultant in the finance industry and a recognized expert on several risk areas that include climate-related risks. David is the primary content provider for the podcast Risk Pearls of Wisdom, that I very much encourage you to check out, that provides thought-provoking risk insights in finance, parenting, and the use of academic models in creating government policy. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's good to have you on the show today. So let's get into it. What are we going to talk about this week? Well, we're going to talk about climate. So climate-related events have cost the United States almost $1.9 trillion since 1980. Between 2015 and 19, economic losses were more than $500 billion. March 2020 showed that the world's largest investment banks are still funneling more than $2.2 trillion into fossil fuels, even after the Paris Agreement. In the UK, 2/3 of banks have no net zero target and no science-based emissions target. Investors are starting to put more emphasis on a firm's sustainability contributions, so that could become increasingly important for companies to focus on this. But do we have reliable and consistent data to measure things? Or do we have a danger of these just becoming tick box exercises? Bottom line, is this all still just PR, or is the tide turning into real policies, incentives, and actions that can make a difference? David, welcome. Where do we start? Where do we start?
Where do we start? Oh dear, oh dear. I think we really have to start with the insurance companies and the asset managers. So they've been in this mindset for quite a long time now, and it's all part of the ESG. And I would say that under the social side and the governance side, the advances have been considerable, and there's legislation, etc. The E is clearly more interesting or more topical now, and of course the banks, as you quite rightly point out, have not been involved until quite recently, and again the trigger has been Carnegie, people like that, who are now talking about the type of stress scenarios that they want to run. And that's primarily to make sure that the financial system is robust in the coming decades. So, and the other thing is that there has been an enormous amount of documentation and stuff out there, of which they are pretty well a variation on what is called the TCFD. So it's the Task Force for Climate Change Financial Disclosure. When I think the disclosure starts to have real sort of meaningfulness. And so if anybody's new to this world, TCFD is definitely the one to read. There's a lot of pitfalls in this space, as you quite rightly pointed out. The main one is the level of response that you want to make. And the nice thing for asset managers is that they can filter out those companies they just don't like. And banks don't seem to have that. Well, they could, but they traditionally don't do that. So, in many ways, we have to think things in a different way. But you're right. You also mentioned the point around, is this a marketing thing? Are we creating stuff that's a gimmick, that's called them green bonds, or derivatives linked to ESG stuff? It does feel very gimmicky and kind of misses the point in many ways. I'm trying to avoid the pitfalls of talking. There is very much a little bit of lecturing that goes on when people talk about climate change, and I think that's fine to a point. But I think we have to sort of switch to another paradigm in the coming months and years.
Yeah, because it doesn't have to be commercial at the end of the day. I mean, of course, we can all sit in a room and agree that we must, make progress on sustainability targets and climate change agenda, the climate change agenda. But the bottom line is we're faced with really tough choices. In fact, I don't know if you saw today, or it might have been yesterday, the FT published a piece from Bill Gates that talked about it, and I thought he articulated it really well, which I understand he also talks about in his book. There is a green premium, is the phrase that I think he used. There's a green premium for some of these policies. And if that green premium is too high, then it doesn't make simple economic sense. So isn't that, really where the crux of the challenge is, that you can't blame people, for not doing all that they should, because there is a real premium and a real cost to business that impacts them.
Yeah, it's funny because when people ask me, people talk about, they put risk into climate change, and that's a recent thing.
Yeah.
And that creates an awful lot of problems because risk management has their own cycle, should we call it that? So identification, measure, monitor, control. That's how we think. And once you go from a strategic marketing kind of goodwill to a risk framework, things definitely change. So when people say to me, what's the biggest risk in climate change? I would say government policy by a country mile. And it is the variation or the randomness in which government policy is created that will create the issues that you're talking about. So the UK government went from, this is through the internal combustion engine, to electric. They went from a sort of 2035 to a 2030 for reasons best known to themselves. Now that reduces the transition path from 15 years to 10 years. And nobody seems to be measuring the impact on car manufacturers, on infrastructure that we need to build. So compressing the time horizon, while noble, actually creates an awful lot of trouble, and it diverts capital away from other areas. So that's a classic, and they seem to do it on a whim, which is quite an irritant, to be honest. The other side is tax, obviously. So the introduction of a carbon tax, again, makes sense, but then it's the speed and the level in which you want to use it.
Not to mention that in the situation that most economies are in the world right now, hopefully coming out of a COVID period, where taxes will be a massive question of how do we actually pay for everything that we've done over the past 12 months and counting. That's a even more tricky subject at the moment, is it? An additional tax.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And but these in many ways these are both financial, and all of those sort of things will impact a company's credit in many ways. The other aspect is this, and I've had many arguments with better risk managers than myself around. I used to talk about the reputational risk of lending to people that aren't doing good things to the planet. So I collectively call them bad actors. And I know people get quite sort of upset when I talk about it that way, because really what we should be talking about is because that feels very defensive. It's like, I'm not going to do something to avoid something wrong happening to me. Whereas if I take the American parlance, you want to think, well, what an offensive move would be, and how do you work with clients who do have a footprint as carbon, or do have a footprint in agriculture, water, pollution, all the other sort of risk factors in the environmental side. And how do you incentivize the way that you lend to them? And this is where I think the industry has gone wrong, by making it a bit, as I said, gimmicky. And I think that's a real shame. But I think it'll work its way out of their systems and get into some very specific. We're lending this money so that you can improve your efficiency, so that you can change the use of chemicals and blah blah blah, blah, and measure it. And I think it keeps coming back to, now that you've stuck this into a risk framework, you've got to identify what is it you're actually measuring, and then how do you measure it? And from that, you can then form a transition path. And I think all the banks I've talked to are sort of mixing things up a little bit at the moment. We need to go back to some very, very basic risk management 101.
Although I must admit, I do worry if it's only the risk angle, then then again the danger is, oh, it's something we have to do. Again, it's a tick box exercise. Yes, we have to measure it. Yes, we have to report on it. There's more burden. It's a feeling of burden rather than how can we attract investment or get lower cost of capital to invest in technologies that actually help us reduce this green premium, which Bill Gates referred to it as. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's, we always have two types of people here, don't we? We have the people who have highlighted the issue and, varying degrees of hysteria, but they've highlighted the issue and it is serious and we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
Then you have the executors. I think that was one of your comments we've talked about in the past.
Absolutely.
You need people to actually execute, and they tend to be less emotional than the formal crowd. It's like, head down, here's the targets, right, let's just do it. And I think that's, having both is fine. At the moment, we only have one side of it. I think, the doers who really need to, make a positive impact, whether it's grand schemes or, chip sort of strategy.
Yeah.
They need to be recognized and, funded and allowed to execute. I think we just need a diversity of those sort of types of people in this space. And
yeah.
From there,
in our pre-discussion, I told you I'm a firm believer in capitalism, and I think innovation truly happens when you have a capitalist that sees a business opportunity, and then you have financing that can fund that capitalist to go after that opportunity. This is where we see disruption happening. This is where we see real change happening, and we need the same thing for this space. We do have a question. I don't know if you can see that, David. Let me just read it out. From a LinkedIn user. I don't know exactly who this came from, but I'll read it out. Is the lecture risk relating to ESG not a function of people jumping on the bandwagon? This person struggles with allowing these types of things becoming political. Things like the change from 10 to 15 years for the internal combustion engine, as you pointed out, David, just moves the effort onto the wrong thing. Is there not the need to do a proper strategy here? And how do we do this between business and government?
Yeah, I think the fact we've got GOP, hosted GOP is the two have to be connected, and that's pure politics, and that's something of a shame in many ways. But again, it pushes things forward. There will be, as you said, a transition at some point between the top-down approach to get us all to take this seriously, and as you said, the bottom-up approach of innovators and the funding of those innovations. And I would say this is one of the most exciting periods I can remember in banking for just the number of stuff that's coming to the fore and getting proper funding. Electricity storage is a very good example of that, carbon capture, efficiency gains, the list goes on. And that comes from, as you said, a decentralized allocation of capital. That puts the regulators into a position where they're allowed to look forward and consider the different sort of climate change type scenarios, and that's fine. And it's a way of aggregating what the banks are doing. But at the end of the day, the banks need to localize the way how they want to operate, so how they want to get to a net to carbon zero, and all the other types of metrics, and just forge a transition path to get there. And that'll be a combination of cajoling and innovation, and some places exclusion. And but we need to let the banks, hate to say this, continue to fund oil companies, because we're not there yet. We can't just stop. And people need to take a bit more of a mature attitude towards that. And that's where I think it's going to be that's where I wouldn't like to be a politician. I think that's an extremely hard thing to achieve.
Yeah, it's about creating momentum. I do agree with the person that asked the question. It's never one lever that needs to be pulled to make this come together. It's several levers. We talked about the risk angle. We talked about the entrepreneurial angle and the commercial aspects. Even let's take something again in our FT article this morning, the procurement angle, procurement policies, and the more that big corporations are actually including the climate change agenda within there, how they purchase. I think there's another lever that can be used, and the more, of course, momentum that gets into that, the more that prices come down. I
think I always get depressed when the likes of Bill Gates they see this as it's always a cost increasing exercise or expense increasing. But we've covered being here quite a few times in the last 250 years, and innovation wins over. And the cost of electricity, cost of solar powers and wind turbines have come down based on Moore's law, essentially, which is phenomenal. And nobody thought that was possible in the early 90s. So I'm very excited. I think it should unleash enormous amount of innovation in the next, well, it has already, but it will continue the next 10 years for sure.
Absolutely. Well, this is always just a bit of a Friday chance to get together and talk about a topic. We can't cover this topic with justice in just a short 15 minutes. So it's a good start. Thank you so much for joining me, David. I think it's a good kind of start to a much longer conversation. To continue the conversation, if people would like to keep asking questions and engaging on this topic, we'll do so online. I've seen a really good point come in from Aaron Lyons. We'll continue to engage with you offline in the comments. I want to thank everyone for joining today on Challenger Network News. We'll be back next Friday with another topic. And of course, if there's anything else you'd like to discuss, please put it in the comments below. Thank you for joining this week, and we'll continue the discussion in the comments. Thanks again. See you next week.